Hey, fellow historians. So glad you're taking a few moments out of your busy schedule to join me for this time of learning while we review Period 5, North versus South, the pinnacle of the American story, the U.S. Civil War. We're going to be dividing our time today between Part 1 and Part 2, getting us all the way up through the territorial compromises and failures of those compromises to the actual war. And then we'll conclude in our next session with the time period known as Reconstruction. For the modified DBQ and the 2020 AP exam, they will have a wide variety of topics upon which to choose from. And I've talked extensively about the fact that they could pick something along the lines of analyze the extent to which the American economy evolved from 1800 to 1945, for instance, or analyze the extent to which civil rights were debated for women or African Americans or Native Americans or immigrants between the 19th and the 20th century. But if we're to look at period 5, these are more micro-focused topics that I think would be a good use of your study time in preparation for the exam. And that would be looking, of course, at the extensive westward expansion or the failures of the territorial compromises from 1848 to 1860. When those shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, or even the raid at Harper's Ferry by John Brown and his boys, those weren't really the first drops of blood spilled in the Civil War. The articulation that I'm going to be making is that began as early as the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, maybe even the Mexican-American War. So lots of causes getting us to this stage when finally war does officially break out in the first land battle at the Battle of Bull Run, or as the Confederates will call it, the Battle of Manassas. You would also see a potential DBQ topic with analyzing the extent to which slavery was debated in the years leading up to the Civil War. We talked in period 4 about the issue of slavery pretty much put onto the back burner. I mean, we saw some abolition movements coming out of the Second Great Awakening, and some of the transcendentalists through civil disobedience were talking a little bit about this idea of judging the moral issue with slavery. But it's going to have a strong economic construct that's going to be woven throughout the South's culture, throughout its politics, and throughout its economics. And so I encourage you in the period 5 investigation guide to take some time to look through those various charts at the beginning. I think it's page 6 or 7, in which it talks about what the South is regrettably going to call a positive good for society. So you could look at a variety of different topics that perhaps analyze how slavery is being debated up through this time period. And then the Civil War itself, the College Board has never been big on you memorizing key battles and dates and generals in those battles. And while that military history might be a source of great excitement for us history nerds, the College Board is looking more for short-term and long-term causes of a war. What are the implications after that conflict? How did the economic fabric of the United States change, particularly with the North and South? How did that economic development further divide the country through what's going to be a period known as Reconstruction? And I've made the case extensively in class that Reconstruction was a failure on part of the federal government, predominantly the Union, in bringing the South back in. But the South, through their failed attempts to integrate society, really in their implementation of Jim Crow laws and segregation and hate groups like the KKK, are going to also really deeply entrench this idea that the South will, in fact, rise again. So failures of Reconstruction are going to land on the fault and the shoulders of both the North and the South as a governmental institution. And I'm going to make the argument that in period 6, once we get to the Gilded Age and we talk about those titans of industry, they're going to be the ones that are going to be largely responsible for the industrial transformation of the country, the agricultural transformation of the country, and what's really going to repair us in what is true Reconstruction through that laissez-faire capitalism. So we do have quite the situation in period 5, and I'm placing an emphasis for just the ability to recall information, or just to frame it a lot easier in the TION, the shun of the conversation. And if we look at the beginning of period 5, all eyes really from the better part of period 4 under John O'Sullivan's idea of manifest destiny. That's going to be carried from period 4 all the way into period 5, and this idea of westward expansion. Uh, as territories come into the Union, how will they become a state? Under what purviews will they become a state? How will they manage themselves with regards to the slavery issue? Will they accept slavery? Will they refuse slavery? And will that Missouri Compromise line, remember that's the line at the 3630 latitude that's going to establish any states that come in or territories that come in and become a state are going to be free, and anything north of that is going to be slaves. So how is this, I stand corrected, anything that's south of that, I think I said that right, is going to be slave, and anything north of that is going to be free. I just want to clarify in case I said that flipped in the opposite. So westward expansion is going to be the crux of statehood, moving westward. And the Civil War, largely fought over the issue of slavery between the North and the South, really is going to be about how is slavery going to expand westward. The moral issue over slavery is going to come to the forefront of this. So calls of abolition are going to come out of the fugitive slave laws that we see, in which the North is going to refuse to, in essence, enact those laws that have been placed and returning slaves to the South. Abolition movements are really going to become prevalent when Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin comes to the surface of the lexicon of America. And we're going to see Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, and other pamphlets or other newspapers or magazines that are going to really call for the gathering of individuals to protest, to stand up against, to make their voice heard in the issue of abolition. The election of 1860 of Abraham Lincoln, remember he only won 44% of the popular vote, split between 4 different candidates, was the final straw, if you will, that the South is going to claim is the catalyst for them seceding from the Union, or that secession, that Southern secession, and of course the start of the Civil War. In the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, at the end of the Battle of Antietam, is going to issue what is called the Emancipation Proclamation. 2 additional shuns there. The emancipation of those slaves are going to further challenge the political and economic structures. And while we'd like to think the Emancipation Proclamation was a feel-good initiative on behalf of the North to free the slaves, we're going to see it was more of a political and military strategy that we'll unpack here in the next few slides. But once the slaves are emancipated, right, what do we do as a nation with the freed slaves that have moved into the industrial North, right? Is that going to create conflict and racial tensions in the North? And it most certainly will. But what is that also going to do now in the South with suffrage, with access to equal facilities? And so in both period 5 and period 6, we're going to see the advent of Jim Crow laws and, of course, the Supreme Court. One of the worst Supreme Court decisions, the issue Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. And then we got Reconstruction, the last of the period 5 discussion, that's going to leave many of these issues unresolved. And we've talked in class extensively about whether or not the South needs to work to re-enter the North, or should the North be the ones really pulling the South back in with open arms. And so we'll see how that is going to be stretched from a political construct, certainly an economic construct with the rapid industrialization of the North, and a social construct, Southerners still thinking that they are deeply Southern and that they will rise again. So period 5 today, our discussion with the tattered flag, showing us visually that the United States red, white, and blue is starting to quickly dissolve. And today's discussion is going to take us from the pre-war territorial disputes of the United States from about 44 to 65, and we'll conclude our discussion in the next session right at the beginning of Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, and then, of course, moving into Reconstruction. The first of these is territorial expansion, and the issue of where slavery is going to go is going to really be parceled out between the Missouri Compromise, the Mexican-American War, the Mexican cession of that territory, California, New Mexico, and modern-day Arizona. And then the Compromise of 1850, Henry Clay is going to come in and provide another opportunity for both the North and the South to come to a temporary agreement, a Band-Aid on a continuing festering wound. Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to put us into a very big predicament with regards to how the issue of slavery is going to be handled through popular sovereignty. Let's let the territories decide that. And while we think that's initially a good idea, hey, let's use our democratic ideals and let the territories decide. It's going to be proved to be problematic when people are going to be moving in from both the free soilers up north to the pro-slavery proponents to the south, and conflict is going to erupt in what we call bleeding Kansas. And then the dreadful Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott v. Sanford, and that Supreme Court decision, which is going to further show that slaves are not human beings, but are in fact property in the eyes of the federal government. And so we'll talk about how that why the Dred Scott decision connects to territorial expansion here in the slides ahead. So there is that Missouri Compromise, just a brief review from period 4. Remember, the number of states that come in that are slave and the number of states that have come in now that are free are even in number. We have 11 each, for a total of 22 states. But then Missouri wants to come in and petition themselves as a slave state. And the Tallmadge Amendment earlier came in and said, okay, Missouri can come in as a slave state, but they can't bring in more slaves. Just the slaves that are there can continue to exist, and then that institution will slowly die out. And that, of course, failed in Congress, and the Tallmadge Amendment proved to be ineffective. And so the Missouri Compromise said, well, if Missouri comes in, it just so happened that Maine wanted to petition for statehood so they could come in as free. And that continues that balance now, at which we are now 12 each moving forward. And then slavery being prohibited north of the 3630 parallel, but the irony is not lost to me that Missouri actually lies north of that line. So they were the last of the states to kind of come in and be able to take on the moniker of being a slave state above or north of the 3630 line. And Jefferson, in his treatise, and you saw that in your writing for the period 4 modified DBQ, all the way until 1820, Jefferson is still alive. Right before his death, had said that once we draw a line in the sand, that will be, in his words, quote, the death knell of the Union. And I think he was prophetic in that sense. He perhaps was right. The Mexican-American War is going to be the next largest acquisition of territory. If we're looking at sheer geographic size, it's the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession territory, pretty much California, modern-day Nevada, modern-day Arizona, and New Mexico. I would say Texas comes in, the annexation of Texas as the third largest territorial acquisition, and then the Oregon Territory being the fourth of those territorial acquisitions. So coupled with Oregon and Texas, the Mexican Cession country, the country ourselves nearly doubled in just 2 years. And because of this fast pace, and I mean fast in the historical sense, just over a couple of decades, this does create a series of haphazard compromises that are fueling the fire of civil war. Remember, the debate is not ending the institution of slavery. Remember, people think, a casual observer of U.S. history in the Civil War say Lincoln wanted to go to war because he wanted to end slavery in the South. He went to war because he wanted to just simply preserve the Union. Later on, through the Gettysburg Address and the moral compass that the North did get, that is where the issue of slavery finally becomes really prevalent, not only in the Emancipation Proclamation, but certainly in the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. California is going to challenge this existing notion of the Missouri Compromise, and I simply ask you why. And that's because California geographically is north and south of this line. You can't divide the state in half and then have half the state slave and half the state free. So there's going to have to be another compromise that's going to come into place at the close end of this Mexican-American War. And here's one other contemporary issue that we see time and time again, all the way from the present, before even the Newburgh conspiracy during the American Revolution, and that is, what do we do with these veterans of a war? The veterans, the British veterans at the end of the French and Indian War were pretty much left behind and in the forts. Their disgruntledness is why they were able to easily take up arms against the Americans. The disgruntled vets, both that were getting their land repossessed in Shays' Rebellion and the Newburgh conspiracy because they weren't getting paid by Congress. Washington did quell that. And so veterans now are resurfacing because they were the fighting component, both the leadership and the fighting component of the ground war there in the southwestern portion of the country. And so after they got back from the Mexican-American War, the Union, being in the kind of economic predicament that it was, right, in the Panic of 1857, wasn't able to fund these soldiers. And therefore, it was very easy for them to take up arms against the Union because the Union, of course, was promising their pay. they weren't able to fulfill that. So the Confederacy said, hey, we'll take good care of you. And so that was a catalyst for why they would serve in a Confederate or a rebel uniform against the Union. There's our map looking at Texas. It's amazing to me when I look at Texas and I see that it is going all the way north up into Wyoming. And so the issue, if we look here, is there's that Missouri Compromise line. You can see why this is a problem. Well, look at the Mexican Cession territory. That's all the land that was received after the Mexican-American War. And what do? Divide that in half if those are going to be territories or states? So it deals with these two areas of California and the northern part of Texas. Now, Texas, coming in as a slave state, agreed to relinquish lands north of that 3630 line, pretty much where the panhandle of Oklahoma is, through the inner Rocky Mountain West and up into Wyoming, giving that back to the unorganized territories of Nebraska and Kansas. In exchange, the southern part of that territory, which is the bulk of the state of the Republic of Texas, could come in and enter as a slave state. California, on the other hand, Henry Clay is going to make the case that California comes in then entirely free, even though it falls south of the Missouri Compromise line. So what does this say about the Missouri Compromise? Well, once Henry Clay establishes the Compromise of 1850, that, for a lack of better terms, null and voids the Missouri Compromise line, because now at this point, that line is proving to be ineffective in controlling that kind of north and south. So California is in, there's that neutral strip of the panhandle of Oklahoma. Texas is now a slave state. And then we've got this unorganized area here of the Utah and the New Mexico territory. Now remember, this unorganized territory is completely unnamed at this point in 1850. We do have Missouri and the Oregon territories, and finally Utah and New Mexico. And Henry Clay said that these two areas could make up their own mind. All right. So we got slave here, we got free here. And what do we do with these two? Well, you make up your own mind. Popular sovereignty would prove to be the best bet. So why, in essence, if I'm asking what the Compromise of 1850, if California is entering as a free state, Texas is ceding the Northern Territory to enter as a slave state, and popular sovereignty for Utah and the New Mexico territories, why was that not an issue when it was in Kansas and Nebraska? And it comes to population. There weren't that many people in Utah and New Mexico. So popular sovereignty and the geographic autonomy, the geographic isolation of those areas really didn't prove problematic. Now, the more populated areas like eastern Kansas and eastern Nebraska along the Mississippi River there, when that popular sovereignty is put forward in the Kansas-Nebraska Act 3 years later, that is where we see the conflict of individuals trying to move into that region to upset the balance of power, to upset the balance of that popular sovereignty. And it's an important note here that part of Henry Clay's compromise is the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. You notice I didn't say the abolition of slavery. Students often will say part of Henry Clay's compromise is that they abolish slavery altogether. And that's inaccurate. Slavery could still exist, but much like the 1807 Act, of abolishing the slave trade from Africa, this prevented the importation of new slaves into the nation's capital. And much like they thought with the Talmadge Amendment, that the institution of slavery would just die out on its own. And lastly, and the most controversial component of the Compromise of 1850 is going to be Henry Clay's bone that he throws to the Deep South to get them to bite off on California being a free state. And that is, if a slave escapes from the South and heads north, it is the responsibility of the northerner to capture that slave and return them to the South. And you could see the problem that would occur. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But as a territorial dispute continues, we see the Utah and New Mexico territories there, and that unorganized territory is going to evolve just 4 years later into the Nebraska and Kansas territories. And once again, as opposed to establishing the Missouri Compromise lines ineffective at this point, it really is going to be ruled unconstitutional after the Dred Scott decision. But that Nebraska and Kansas now have it in their own ability to exercise popular sovereignty and decide for themselves. And as you can see, the bottom part of that bleeding Kansas, the map there shows that's going to be the center point. And what I think is almost poetic or ironic in an American sense is that there at 54, the literal heart of the nation, right? The center of the nation not just geographically, but metaphorically, is burning and bleeding, so to speak, as the dawn of civil war approaches. So that's going to repeal the Compromise of 1820, and there's that popular sovereignty issue. And how is it going to make the issue worse? Because it doesn't really establish a definitive yes or no. And this is drug out for the better part of 3.5 to 4 years. And I'm going to make the case as the first blood spilled in the American Civil War. Dred Scott versus Sanford is going to be one of the worst Supreme Court decisions. I'm going to partner that up with Plessy versus Ferguson, and I'm going to say Korematsu versus the United States, giving the constitutional authority for Japanese internment in World War II. But we have the slave of an army surgeon, John Emerson. You remember, Dred Scott was taken to Illinois and Wisconsin in the 1830s when Emerson was given reassignment orders. Emerson had passed away, and so Dred Scott, being property, and I'm using this contextually, of course, was passed down to the children of Dr. Emerson. And so it was at that point that Dred Scott petitioned for his freedom, taking his case all the way to the Supreme Court, claiming that he is no longer property of the Emerson family, and that he was free once he entered a state north of that Missouri Compromise line. And the Supreme Court, in what we would hope would be respecting the rights of Dred Scott, voted against him in that ruling that he was still, in fact, property, regardless of the fact that he crossed the Missouri Compromise line. It would be no different than taking one's personal effects, like luggage, with them north of the Missouri Compromise line or again south. And so a drastic a turn of events there when we see the federal government, the Supreme Court itself, giving credence or solidifying this issue of, once again, property. So the calls for abolition, after we've gotten through the territorial expansion and we get to the calls for abolition, we get to the fugitive slave laws, and he's going to compel, Henry Clay is, citizens that capture runaway slaves in the North, denying them a trial. And places like Wisconsin and Vermont, sought nullification. I think that's ironic because one of the biggest critics of that nullification was South Carolina. And they're basically saying, we're just taking that from your playbook, John Z. Calhoun. Chill, brother. So we see riots in Boston taking place, in Philadelphia over these laws. It was difficult to determine who were recently escaped slaves and who were freed African Americans in the North. So this was just a tremendous challenge for the North, really bringing into question the issue of the humanity of this. Is it a responsibility of a Northerner to go out there and capture? And I'm just trying to think how that even pans out, right? If you see a family, right, walking through the streets, is it the responsibility of a Northerner to gather up that individual, capture them, kidnap them, if you will, and take them back to the Deep South? And do they take them to the Mason-Dixon line and drop those individuals off? Do they meet the owner? And the newspapers were instrumental in that, right? Taking out ads like you see here on the screen, with actual bounties for individuals being returned back to the Deep South. So this is going to prompt folks like Harriet Tubman and many, many others to really push for the Underground Railroad, allowing for the escapes of those slaves. Harriet Tubman being one of the many conductors. And the reason why it was called the railroad was because of the verbiage that was used during this time period. Various houses, the Anderson farm was a particular station. The Reynolds barn was another station. This track with the trees would have ribbons wrapped around them and certain carvings in the trees. Lanterns would be hung in the forest. And so these would provide that kind of safe haven, that track, if you will, up river streams to finally get them to the safe north. During this time period, we saw well over 100,000 slaves escaping through this network from even early, before the antebellum period of the 1780s to 1863. And they did get assistance from other religious groups. Remember, during the time of the Second Great Awakening, several groups like the early American Episcopalians and the Methodist Church partnered with folks like the Quakers, really calling for Northern abolition and providing safe haven for those African Americans migrating to the North. Anti-slavery literature really, really pushed the moral issue of slavery to the forefront of the American vision. By its worldwide acclaim, Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the greatest books sold during this time period, did something unique that no other piece of literature did with slavery, and that's that it humanized the institution. It allowed individuals sitting at a breakfast table in Connecticut for the first time to see, wow, this is remarkably grotesque, and I want to do something about this. Now, we don't cover period 8 in this course, but I like to always make comparisons about the literature of this time period, really showcasing the brutality of slavery and bring it to the forefront, allowing people to wrestle with the moral issue of that, much like they did in Vietnam. You know, the atrocities of war weren't often seen in World War I and World War II because it was sanitized before it made the press, before it went before the American people in newsreels. But Vietnam was one of those wars in which people saw the brutality of war immediately. And so people's support of the war changed and lacked significantly in the 1960s, not because Vietnam was any more brutal than any of the other wars, but because people were exposed to the atrocities of that war. So really, for the better part of Jamestown to the present, meaning Harriet Beecher Stowe's time period, people weren't apprised of the brutalities of slavery, and that's why it came to the surface at this point in American history. And so Lincoln, and upon meeting Harriet Stowe, and I always love the conversation that they had, was quite fond of Harriet Beecher Stowe, meeting her often and discussing the issues at hand, saying, "So you're this little woman who made the Great War?" And she would just simply nod. The election and the secession of 1860 is going to be the final straw on this. If you look at the variety of the candidates that we have here, each one of them come to the table with a very specific theme. We'll come back to Lincoln in just a second. But Stephen Douglas is bringing forward the popular sovereignty issue. If we remember, just years before the election, Abraham Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas engaged in the Lincoln-Douglas debates there in 57 when they were running for the Illinois Senate seat, a series of debates, of course, talking about, and that's where a house divided cannot stand, Lincoln's famed words during those debates. But Stephen Douglas, not a staunch pro-slavery guy, but he is much more about popular sovereignty, and we saw that that's proved really ineffective in Kansas and Nebraska. The other two on the other end of the issue, John Bell is going to come up with the Constitutional Unionist Party, saying that the federal government should support slavery but also defend the Union. I don't know how you really do that, so he's not really saying much in his platform. Breckinridge is a Southern Democrat, like many of the Democrats during that time period, and well through Reconstruction up until about FDR are going to have this very strong Southern. I would even argue up until Lyndon B. Johnson in the Deep South, Strom Thurmond and those guys are going to really have a kind of a strong deep Southern connection, and he's going to claim that the federal government must protect slavery. So if you look at the election map, the Electoral College there of Abraham Lincoln's election of 1860, it really follows along the lines of the Civil War itself. You've got your border states, the Union and the Confederacy. So upon that instant notification to the nation that Lincoln was elected president, shots fired and rang out at Fort Sumter. Now, Lincoln assumed that this conflict was going to be over with rather quickly. So, and that's evidenced by the Union just kind of taking their time to get ready for war. They weren't in a prepared sense like the South was. So the South did have somewhat of a military advantage at the beginning of the Civil War, particularly at the first land battle there at the Battle of Bull Run, which is only about 13 miles west of Washington, D.C. So what really shook Lincoln in his boots was realizing, and he could see it from the White House, the smoke smoldering up into the sky, and from the battle itself there at Bull Run, realizing that the South was very serious about this. And what he initially thought was going to be a very quick conflict turned to a long 5-year drawn-out Civil War. And so the major battles of the Civil War, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that in the next session. And we're not really going to make you responsible for memorizing all these battles. I'm not throwing this map up here for you to push pause and write down all of these with the dates. But I just want you to step back away from it for just a second and be able to, for instance, if you had this as a stimulus in your DBQ, how could this help you shore up your analysis, providing some historical context? We could assume that most of the battles, as you could see here, were fought in the South. So what does that tell us about the territory of the Deep South? What does that tell us about the state of the physical geography of the farmlands and of the homes? It's going to be battle-ridden. It's going to be torn up, much like northern France and Belgium was in World War I. We could see a Union blockade of ports in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. This is telling us that there was a strong naval presence in the North that really allowed them to cut off, through Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, the Deep South from accessing their ports like Charleston and New Orleans. We can also see that there was a Union victory north of the Capitol, but there was also a Confederate victory north of the Capitol at the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Gettysburg. So this tells us that the South was able to offensively push way north of the Capitol. And if they were able to secure Gettysburg and turn their sights southward, you could see their Bull Run, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, the 7 Days Battle, in Antietam were all Southern victories. If Gettysburg was that the case, Washington, D.C. would be a sitting duck. So Gettysburg, at the point when Lincoln delivers that address 7 years ago, is going to be a real turning point in the U.S. Civil War. So looking at advantages and disadvantages, and I would encourage you in your investigation guide to take some time and look at what are some of the advantages and disadvantages that both sides had in fighting in this engagement. And we'll expand upon that a little bit more in our next discussion. So let's review. If we look back at period 4, we'll see the long-term causes, really those northern tariffs under Andrew Jackson. Again, this is period 4, way even before period 5. It's going to get us to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Because of those northern tariffs, the tariff of abomination, John C. Calhoun in the South Carolina Exposition is going to lead this nullification crisis, saying we don't have to follow your law. So we're already seeing, and I'm going to make the argument, if you want to be real complex here, that the Virginia and Kentucky resolves, right, under Thomas Jefferson pushing back against John Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts is a really good example of the South already making the case that we don't have to follow the ever oppressive federal government. I mean, shoot, why stop there? Let's say the second the Pilgrims landed in the Massachusetts colonies at Plymouth Rock, and then Jamestown was established, we already had a North and the South. But don't, in your writing, say the cause of the Civil War was because the Pilgrims landed north and John White and Rolfe landed south at Roanoke and Jamestown. We've got the political short-term causes. These are all going to be political in nature. Again, the Comp of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act of 54, Bleeding Kansas, and Dred Scott. That's going to address the political component of this, but we need to, of course, address the social causes of the Civil War. Abolition meetings and the fugitive slave laws we talked about under Henry Clay's Comp of 1850, that Underground Railroad being led by Harriet Tubman, and the literature and newspapers by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And lastly, the immediate causes. This is the right next to it. This is your Lexington and Concord, right? This is Pearl Harbor. This is unrestricted submarine warfare. This is the sinking of the Maine, right, in the Spanish-American War. The election of 1860 and Fort Sumter, all right up against that. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, I put slavery on the screen as connecting all of those. Slavery is the trunk of the tree, and upon these we have all these branches. But I don't want your writing to be simplified by saying, what are some, causes that led up to the American Civil War? And you just put slavery and kind of just expand upon slavery as an institution. That will not be well served. It's true, but your analysis needs to show all of these things in that screen. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for the better part of our discussion today. I hope you were able to get something out of this for your time with me. When we gather next time, we'll be looking at period 5, part 2, in which we'll look at Lincoln's assassination, some key turning points, Gettysburg Address, Emancipation Proclamation, and then getting us to Reconstruction. I look forward to welcoming you back then, and I thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join me. I'll see you next time.